We sent a fishing vessel out to Land's End, where they loaded 5 metric tonne of cannabis onto a fishing vessel. Prior to that, we went out fishing and we fished loads of cod. We froze the cod, we put all the cannabis in there, put ice over it, and then put the fish on it. I had a father who was a career criminal. We lived in the flats in Stockwell. I had a wonderful mother, and she was like sort of the antidote of my father. They was a complete mixture of opposites, both my parents. And sadly, my dad just couldn't cope with life in a normal way. He was quite an aggressive man. He was a beautiful man as well. But my mother was the sort of the anchor of the family. She was the love of the family. It was a funny childhood. I mean, at a very early age, there was some sort of sex abuse on me at a very young age when I was about 5 by the babysitter. So that had an influence on, well, a major influence on who I thought I was. You know, it was quite uncomfortable. It was quite frightening in the sense that it was, you know, my parents was in the next room and they didn't realise what was going on. So there was a scream in my heart for my mother, like it was an abandonment situation. But that was sort of one of the first things that sort of obviously affected me, you know. My siblings were brilliant. They were both sort of grade A students. I wasn't. I couldn't concentrate. I didn't function well at school. And then at a very young age, I started stealing and getting myself in trouble.
So what kind of man did you see your dad when you were growing up?
Well, my dad was on this pedestal. He was sort of very well known in the criminal fraternity in London. You know, the likes of the great train robbers, the Cray twins, and all things like that. And he tried to maintain a lie that he wasn't who he was, and he tried to protect his family by putting us in good schools. He pretended he was an antique dealer, but he was a big criminal in London. So there was always that confusion, and I saw him do a few things. I see an act of violence, not once, but twice, against someone else, and that sort of frightened the life out of me. One day I went out into the garage and he was making a set of number plates. And obviously it was for whatever it was for obviously a robbery or something like that. And then I started to realise that when I used to go out with my dad, there'd be certain people that we would meet and maybe I might see them in the newspapers. And I started to realise that people like Freddie Foreman, who was a notorious gangster in London. And it's weird, and then I just grew into it. And then when I went to work for my dad when I was about 17, he had a commercial, he used to sell commercial lorries, and I just started to see things then, you know. And then they was involved with the pornographic shops, it sounds crazy, doesn't it, in London. And so at a very early age, I used to go out and help him to collect the money. It was organised crime from day, you know, from when I started to realise what he was. It was like I wasn't surprised, but crime became really apparent to me when I was about 19. I started stealing antique furniture in places like Harley Street and things like that, which I got arrested for. I thought I was an antique dealer, but it was all stolen goods. And then I went from there to sort of buying and selling drugs. So at a very early age of about 22, 23, I was earning sort of copious amounts of money in comparison to my pals, my friends. And I wasn't frightened of the consequences of criminal activities. There was something that wasn't right in me. I was dysfunctional. I was full of rage. So I was forever trying to fix myself, whether it be wine, women, song, money, and the criminal sort of fraternity sort of ticked that box because there was always a high and a low. There's a danger. You live on the edge, and the addict loves that, you know. So that was sort of how I developed into a criminal. I was in a car chase with a friend of mine, and there was a suspicion that there was drugs in the car, and he was being followed. And we was in Battersea, and the police drove past. They see part of the number plate. They radioed it in by all accounts, and it was the guy they wanted. So they set up, it was a police chase. And it went on for about 3 or 4 miles, but this guy could drive. I mean, he was unbelievable. Police were everywhere, helicopters. We wound up going around the back of Tooting in South London, and there's a mental home there. And there was all this big wooden fence, about 18 foot up in the air. There was cocaine in the car, and he tried to go through the fence, and we hit a corrugated post doing about 60 mile an hour. And the car went up in the air. He went through the window screen, his nose came out, the steering wheel embedded in his chest, and I was in the back, and I dislocated my ankle and my knee. Police arrived. We get taken to court, we get taken to hospital, taken to court. I'm in a wheelchair. I've got internal bleeding. He's broken both of his arms, his nose is out there, but he's wanted badly, I wasn't. And fortunate for me, you can go, if you don't get bail, you go to a place called Judge and Chambers. And I went to Judge and Chambers and I got bail. Came out the prison, got well, got better, and I absconded. I went to live in Spain. This was in the early 80s, where there was an extradition thing that they couldn't bring you back into the UK. I was living down there, friends with my father, and they sort of helped me, get along my little journey. I was only a young kid. My father was a cannabis smuggler, and he was a big cannabis smuggler with his partner, another sort of well-known sort of villain, a guy called Joe Pyle, and they was involved with all sorts of things, and so I sort of was on the peripherals of that.
So what were the things you did together with your father?
Well, we started smuggling cannabis. Early days, my sort of father was involved out with the Americans, the sort of the five families out in the States. And I'm not saying that they was involved with what went on here, but I think there was an influence there. So it was high-level crime, yeah. And so when they started smuggling into the UK, I just sort of went along with it. And like I say, I was on the peripherals of it, sort of earning a little bits and pieces. And then when I really got involved as I grew older, we started smuggling, in very large amounts. We sent a fishing vessel out to Land's End, where they loaded 5 metric ton of cannabis onto a fishing vessel. Prior to that, we went out fishing and we fished loads of cod. We froze the cod, those big yellow plastic or metal, whatever they are, they put the fish in them. We put all the cannabis in there, put ice over it, and then put the fish on it. And funny enough, they called my dad the Codfather when he got arrested. But anyway, so we brought it in. As we was unloading it, there was about 60 officers there, because there was about 17 people there. And I think there was about 12 or something like that armed officers. So it was an armed unit there waiting for us. All these lights went on like that, and they started shouting our names out. There was night sights, there was rifles, and they got hold of me and they slung me to the floor. And they asked me, again, this sort of traumatized kid I had inside of me, a penny for your faults. And they expected me to respond in a very bad way, because I'd act quite aggressively a minute ago. And I had a tear in my hand. All I could think about was my children.
What was your sentence?
Originally we had a £3 million fine or do 6 years and 12 and a half years. So at one time it looked like I was doing 18 years. They dropped one charge of the 2.5 ton, and the charge in the end was, I think, 4.5 metric tons. And I got 12 and a half years.
So what was life in prison like?
You know what? We're creatures of habit. And I think whatever environment we're in, we sort of adapt and obtain. I don't know how it works, to be quite honest with you. But life in prison wasn't that bad. It wasn't bad where you was frightened or, we knew everybody. We was known on the streets of London and sort of around the place. And I think it comes with a little bit of an ego and a pride, a prestige thing, because at the particular time it was the largest importation of cannabis into the country. And life in prison, you get what you need sometimes. You have your own little ways of going through it. But being with my dad was odd. I was in a prison cell with my dad for 2 years. That was odd. And as much as he was a cannabis smuggler, he'd never used cannabis before in his life. Until we was in the cell together. That was quite odd. That was quite strange. And I started to really get to know him, and I could see that what he had in his discomfort, I had too. We was very similar. And so my mum come up on a visit, on the very first visit, and she said You know, you're going to see things about your dad that you don't like. And she was right, because I could see myself. And there was things about, like I say, things I didn't like about myself, I could see in the old man. But, you know, we stuck together, and he didn't realise how broken I was.
Are there any worst experiences you can think of that you had in prison?
Well, the worst experiences was, first of all, it's overwhelming when you hear how long you're doing. For me, it was my children. It was my lovely kids who I wasn't going to see for a while. But there wasn't really any... The only thing in prison is that you lose, you know, your freedom. But for me, freedom wasn't on the outside. I was in my own prison.
So what was the turning point for you?
Turning point was, I suppose, there was a guy who'd spent 22 years in the Nick. He was a lifer. And I just had a big fat joint in the cell. And I was sort of stoned. And he came up to my door. And he said, Michael, he said, there's only one person that you've got to get on with in this prison. And I said, who's that? Thinking it was another inmate. He said, it's yourself. And he was a recovering alcoholic. And he was 20 years sober. And I went back in the cell and I just knew that I didn't get on with Michael. And I smoked more joints, had a little bit of a panic attack, and there was a Bible there. And I picked this Bible up and I was just scrolling through it. And I found a scripture in there that says the faith the size of a mustard seed. And just for a minute, I felt peaceful. I don't know how. It didn't last long, but I remembered it. When the people come round down from HTB in the chapel, it was very similar. And they prayed this prayer. There was lots of men in the room. And something happened. It wasn't mass hysteria. It wasn't religious. I didn't see Jesus. I didn't have a vision. It was just something that touched that chord, which connected me to my mother. I felt that was a connection spiritually. But the reason I grabbed it, because it touched my pain, my trauma, my heartache. And it didn't sort of heal it straight away, but it was like a little key to a lock that maybe this might be where I find my way out.
So what was life out of prison like?
Well, when you come out of prison, it's, you know, in prison, the only thing you've got to do is turn your light on and off. Or you have no responsibilities other than to look after yourself. So when you come out of prison, you have the best intentions. But the monkey on the shoulder, the devil on the shoulder. I was on a beach down in West Witterings, and a mate of mine was there who I used to use drugs with. A lovely boy, he didn't realise. And I look up and I see some white powder on the end of his nose. And I asked him for a bit. And he said, yeah, come on, he remembered the old days, bit of nostalgia. So I relapsed. But in that relapse, it cost me dearly. I had an affair. I went back to my old way of thinking. I hated myself again. I was ashamed of myself. I had no money. I couldn't afford an Oyster card. You know, it was crazy. But in that, I had this faith to believe that something greater than me was about to turn me around. And it's been hard. It's been a hard journey. But in losing it, I really found myself again. And I got taken from Hollywood to Cricklewood, and there's nothing wrong with Cricklewood. But so I came from the top of this sort of thing, and I smashed to the floor. And everyone, I owed money, you know, friends of mine, family, everyone tried to help me. But I believe it was my faith that done it, and that's why I accepted it. But I think my attitude to life, the principle of life today, is if I'm kind to myself, I can be kind to everyone in here. And I'm starting to enjoy life again, and it's thanks to what I believe in that I'm on my way to at my age to enjoy the autumn of my life with my family.
If you ever have to flee an airport, don't run out of departures, because that's where we're expecting you to go. Go down to arrivals, because a lot of other people coming in there. It's always a floor under departures.